Juneteenth a federal holiday to appease black people, not for any other reason. People have been celebrating Juneteenth since about 1866, which is the day after the events that we now consider to be historic events of June the 19th in 1865. And I'll just break it down for you guys in generally speaking. Obviously, the Emancipation Proclamation was established, I believe, around 2.5 years before Juneteenth, 1865. But obviously, everybody that were enslaved had not been freed yet. During the Emancipation Proclamation, it established the transition of slaves, people who were identified as slaves, to now becoming free individuals in our society. Now, many people were freed during that time. There was many people who were still enslaved during that time because the freedom had not gotten to them at that point. And in Galveston, Texas, is where, 2.5 years later, after the Emancipation Proclamation, we have black people that were in a small area in Galveston, Texas, that had not gotten the news that they were free. And let's fast forward to the Civil War being fought, the 13th Amendment being passed. Right around that time is when Juneteenth became a thing, and there was a message being passed down the chain by an individual to let people in Galveston know that they were actually free. Now, people who process what I just said, or people who understand the magnitude of that particular day, may argue that that's why we celebrate Juneteenth. Now, I have two arguments to that. They don't tell you that the Galveston, Texas Freedom Declaration wasn't the actual end, or wasn't the actual last group of people to be freed. They don't tell you that the Choctaw Choctaw Nation still owned slaves after June 19th of 1865. It wasn't until 1866 that the Choctaw Nation released their slaves. So technically, it wasn't June 19th, 1865, that black people were finally notified of their freedom. It was actually after the Native Americans freed their slaves a year later. But they won't tell you about the freedom of slaves. They won't tell you that, or when I say about the freedom of slaves, they won't tell you that the Native Americans had slaves too, and they were the last to release slaves, because that will go against the narrative. Now, that brings me to my second point. Knowing historically what happened and the historical significance of what happened in June 19th is important. And if you don't know that, you're setting a precedent of creating a falsehood and a false celebration that I believe caused more division than it caused connectivity or togetherness or unity. And beyond that, let's talk about what the Democrats are doing. The reason that Democrats are actually making this a big deal is because they want to divide between black and white. They want black people to believe that the white man has their independence in 1776, 1777, July the 4th is the white man's Independence Day, and that June 19th is the black man's Independence Day. And they want to draw a parallel because they want a continual battle to be had or fought in the minds of black people to believe that they don't belong in America, that they don't have a standing here, that the 1776 only apply to white people, when we all know that that's not true. We all know the fundamental foundation of how we get to June 19th, how we get to the passage of the 13th Amendment, how we get to the Civil Rights Act being passed, how we get to that point is because of 1776. And I want people to not forget that. If you want to celebrate Juneteenth, that's fine. Do it. But don't try to celebrate Juneteenth in lieu of, or try to make it seem like this is black people's real freedom, when if you look at the totality of what went on, this is a Southern Confederacy issue. Although Galveston, Texas, from the things that I've read, that wasn't quite Confederate territory, so that's why they were notified a lot later than everybody else. However, every black person that lived in the United States of America that we know now as the United States of America weren't slaves. They want you to believe that every black man was a slave and every black man lived in the South as a slave. And when the abolishment of slavery happened, all black people were enslaved and they all became free. That's not necessarily what happened. Not every black person was a slave, and not every black person was under the thumb of the white man. If you go way back in history, before they prohibited black people from voting, in our country, voting was based upon ownership, land ownership, property ownership. And there was many black people who owned property that were able to vote while white people weren't able to vote. When you go back in history, there was many black people who owned slaves. The first legal slave owner in the history of slavery in America was a black man. First legal slave owner, black man, Anthony Johnson. If you don't believe me, go look it up. Anthony Johnson was the first legal slave owner in the United States of America, and that we know now as the United States of America. And he had 2 indentured servants. He went to court. He sued that he may own those 2 men for life. He won in a court of law and owned those 2 men for life, being the first legal slave owner in the United States of America. So they want to build this facade that is white versus black, that it's the white man's freedom versus the black man's freedom. And they're doing this, and they want to make sure they push it so they can gain political power. Now, some black people are fooled into believing that this was done in good faith. When, if you go back to my first point, if you look at all of the federal holidays, every federal holiday that I can think of deals with an issue on a federal level. This is not the celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation, which was on a federal level. This is not the celebration of the 13th Amendment, which was on a federal level. This is not Veterans Day. This is not, I can go through all the federal holidays. I pulled them up. Thanksgiving, Christmas. Let's go. Martin Luther King, the passage of the Civil Rights Act. That was a federal accomplishment, which yielded results for every single state in the Union. Let's say the Union. Every single state in what we know now is the United States of America. All of the federal holidays deal with federal issues. Juneteenth is a regional issue. All the other black people were free. Many of them knew they were free. Many of them were exercising their freedom. One sector in Galveston, Texas had not been made aware officially yet. Should not be a federal holiday. So, ladies and gentlemen, I got about a minute left, and I want to conclude with saying, don't allow division. Celebrate things for the right reasons. Don't allow them to pit us against one another. It is okay to celebrate Juneteenth if you're doing it in the right spirit, understanding that we all have gained independence in the United States of America. 1776 was the day, and we now observe that freedom that has been residual until today and forevermore.